on mistaken identity. For this week, we read chapters 5 and 6, Law and Order and Universality. And chapter 5 starts off talking about Stuart Hall, a Jamaican British Marxist and the author of 1978's Policing the Crisis. Oh, sorry, I'm going to write down when I started. 1978's Policing the Crisis, Mugging the State and Law and Order. That basically, looks at policing and racism and class struggle. His analysis of the decomposition and disorganization of the workers' movement and the new political strategy of the ruling class is essential for understanding the political field in which identity politics took root, Hayter says. The British Labour Party was unable to manage the crisis at the time, in the late 70s, within the existing economic relations while maintaining its base in an organized and assertive working class. Its role became to contain class struggle, to ensure that workers' demands did not interfere with a favorable climate for investment. Hayter says, well, I think Hall says, that this was a crisis of hegemony, a crisis not only of the economy, but also of its management, and thus a crisis of the state itself. Moral panic and economic instability legitimated the state's resort to the use of repression as crisis management. This ended up rationalizing and normalizing policing, or over policing. I mean, policing is over policing, right? By definition. And it lent legitimacy to the state's initiative to discipline the intransigent working class, whose strikes were relentless and powerful. There was a strong association, or an effort to associate, crime with Black youth in Britain at this time that Hall talked about. And so as a result, Black youth who were already mobilized by Black consciousness were also the most affected by the economic recession. The consequence was, quote, nothing less than the synchronization of the race and the class aspects of the crisis. This synchronization was clearly and concretely manifested in the police. I think we see this today here, and obviously, like with the recurring, anti-racist police upticks in Black struggle. The upheaval in the inner cities could not be understood as a separate phenomenon from the struggles of factory workers, but they represented two political compositions requiring different organizing strategies. In the US, this division in political strategy was most powerfully represented by two organizations, the Black Panther Party and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. While the Black Panther Party explicitly grounded itself in the agency of the quote unquote lumpen proletariat in the streets rather than the factories, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers argued that Black workers at the point of production had the greatest revolutionary potential. The great merit of Stuart Hall's book, Policing the Crisis, was to understand how these two class compositions developed out of a unified structural logic. That's Hayter. And here's a quote from Hall, from the book. Although the Black and white poor find themselves objectively in the same position, they inhabit a world ideologically so structured that each can be made to provide the other with its negative reference group. I mean, it's there right in the words, Black and white. The quote, manifest cause of each other's ill fortune. As economic circumstances tighten, so the competitive structure between workers is increased, and a competition structured in terms of race or color distinction has a great deal of mileage. So the crisis of the working class is reproduced once again through the structural mechanisms of racism as a crisis within and between the working classes. So that's really that end point, that the crisis is reproduced within the class, is really important. And so Stuart Hall's most famous quip or short quote, which, anyway, takes a lot of investigating, is race is the modality in which class is lived. And let's see, yeah, so Haider explains this by saying Black members of the working class develop a consciousness of class struggle through the experience of race. At the same time, since race was also a structural feature of the capitalist response to class struggle from below, it plays the role of an instrument of division and disorganization. This means that race can also end up becoming an obstacle to the development of class organization. And again, back to Hall, he says, capital reproduces the class as a whole, structured by race. It dominates the divided class in part through those internal divisions, which have racism as one of their effects. I think this is noteworthy, like Hall is saying racism, and this is what, we've been on for a long time, racism is an effect of race, not the other way around, right? So racism contains and disables the representative class organizations by confining them in part to strategies and struggles which are race specific, which do not surmount its limits, its barriers. Through the framework of race, it continues to defeat the attempts to construct at the political level organizations which do in fact adequately represent the working class as a whole. That is, which represent it against capitalism, against racism, end quote. That was Hall again. Let's see, so class domination depended on a, quote, tilt in the, this is Hall's argument, that class domination depended on a tilt in the operation of the state away from consent and toward the pole of coercion. The moral panic over crime was key to the state's stabilization. And again, we see this recurring all the time. I feel like right when Biden was elected, it was the Democrats doing this, but most famously Hillary, and then before that, Reagan. Hillary was super predators, let's see, the perceived rise in crime got the public to support increasingly coercive state measures. The neoliberal transition was also a defeat for the new social movements, just as much as it was for organized labor. The movement's demands lived on, but grew increasingly detached from the mass mobilizations that could advance them as a challenge to the whole system. Progress was made at a cultural level, changing our language, but the underlying material structures were spared, Haider says. As a result, progressive language was then appropriated as a new ruling class strategy. Bill Clinton, following the lead of Thatcher and Reagan, and also serving as an inspiration to Tony Blair's Thatcherite rebranding of the Labor Party, Clinton delivered NAFTA and the crime bill and the welfare reform bill, major assaults on the class and major, instruments of racial oppression. But Clinton delivered them in a cultural style that played on the diversity of the new times, leading Toni Morrison to comment famously that Clinton was the, quote, first Black president. But while he played, and this is Haider, while he played sax on Arsenio Hall, on the Arsenio Hall show, for those of you so young you don't remember, yeah, right, where my dog pound out or whatever. While he played sax on the Arsenio Hall show, Hillary Clinton was describing Black youths as super predators, right? The rise of the right is explained by the decomposition and disorganization of the working class, not in consciousness, false or otherwise. Sorry, I kind of rushed that point, but that's another really important one, about the rise of fascism now, you know. Today's, let's see, Haider says that at the end of this chapter that today's youth lack a, quote, spirit of youthful and rebellious optimism. There's a certain sadness that Haider identifies, like in, I guess, well, he cites a lot of college, like campus activism. He says that this sadness is the primary cause of the restriction of politics to one's personal identity. Not only has the idea of universal emancipation come to seem old-fashioned and outmoded, but the very possibility of achieving anything beyond temporary protection of individual comfort seems like a delusion. And goddamn, is that true or not, right? Kind of arguments that we have to make. All right, so in the last chapter called Universality, Haider says that the immigrant represents a core problem for political thought. There's a fundamental contradiction of the nation state in the confrontation between defining people and interaction between defining people as ethnos, an imagined community of membership or affiliation. So ethnos and demos, the collective subject of representation, decision-making, and rights. And so that contradiction is really well expressed in the Slavers' Constitution, which is what I always like to refer to it now, every time I can remember at least. You know, which starts off with the proposition of "we the people," and immediately, and Haider calls this the original sin of the U.S. nation state, because obviously this was written by slavers and was used to justify slavery. So you know, basically Black people had to be taken out of being people. Let's see. The immigrant problem in the minds of the imperialist state is solved with a kind of fictive ethnicity, among, in our case, U.S. citizenry. And Haider calls this the wall that Trump hopes to build inside our heads, which, you know, he's writing about Trump, but, you know, it's never ending, and it's not limited to Trump. Let's see, he talks about Marx's On the Jewish Question, which rejects an abstract universalism, and as well as the particularism of the minority. It demands that we go beyond political emancipation to overcome the exploitation of the market. And then he gets into Haider gets into the paradox of rights. And he cites Wendy Brown, who says that rights emerged in modernity as two things. One, a vehicle for emancipation and protection from the state, and two, a mode of securing and naturalizing the dominant social powers. Rights end up defining groups by their victimhood. They end up reduced to a reaction to injury, Haider says. The emancipatory content disappears, of the concept of rights. And then he cites Alain Badiou, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing, and who says that the liberal paradigm of rights is the foundation of imperialism. I'd really like to investigate that more, but it's kind of in reference to this "we the people" type of twist. It's the foundation of the civilizing mission, the white man's burden, humanitarian intervention. So rights are used to you know, for the imperialist imposition around the world. And then Haider contrasts, let's see, I'm about 15. Okay, I think I'm doing okay. Haider contrasts rights from two different versions of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Sorry. So there were two versions, one before and one after the Haitian Revolution. And the one before depended on what Haider calls a juridical universalism, which grants no agency to the subjects of rights, and their only political existence is mediated by their protection by the state. And he does say by, I expected it to say from, but by the state. And then the second version from the French Declaration of the Rights of Man was brought onto the historical stage, Haider says, by the uprisings of the enslaved of the Haitian Revolution. And he calls this insurgent universality. Insurgent universality. And this, by contrast, makes us, this conception says that we're active agents, not passive victims, and that emancipation must be self-emancipation. Haider points to Toussaint Louverture, who rejected the leader of the Haitian Revolution, who rejected overtures from Napoleon, because Bonaparte, because slavery persisted in France's other colonies. And so he's like, we're not flying your colors. So the quote from Louverture is around this is, it is not a liberty of circumstance conceded to us alone that we want. It is the absolute adoption of the principle that no man born red, black, or white can be the property of his fellow. Really beautiful. And then Haider cites Faiz Ahmad Faiz, a Pakistani Marxist poet, who says that he fights for his own liberation. He makes the point that one fights for your own liberation precisely because one fights for that of the stranger. Yeah, I love that too. That makes me think of Daniel Ben Said. Oh God, am I going to come up with a quote? Is it loyalty to strangers? It's kind of a summation of communism. I'm not sure if it's loyalty though. I think I got that name wrong. I'll have to look it up. Damn, and this is on video. Don't worry, nobody watches them anyway. So insurgent universality is, Haider says, is created and recreated in the act of insurgency. So to me, this is like kind of one of the keys in a lock that we want to unlock. Like, how do we defeat racial ideology? How do we defeat oppression, or oppressive ideas in the working class? Very important job of ours. And we do it through engaging in common struggle. That's the crucible where this stuff can get worked out, and ultimately in changing the structures around us. So, all right, to wrap up the chapter, and I want to talk about a few reviews and some reactions from around the left on this book. But to wrap up this chapter, Demita Frazier of the Combahee River Collective said, we never practiced what people now call identity politics. We focus not on particular aspects of our identities, but the totality of what it meant to be Black women in the diaspora. Haider says insurgent universality with relation to this necessarily confronts and opposes capitalism. And another member of the Combahee River Collective, Barbara Smith, said that the power of Combahey's Black feminism comes from its anti-capitalism. And she says that's what gives it its sharpness, edge, thoroughness, and its revolutionary potential. And then he ends with going back to CLR James about Haiti. James, who wrote The Black Jacobins, which we really need to read together at some point. The RSN's been talking about it for a long time. James said that James showed that every step away from the primacy of this insurgent universality leads back to the particularism of the existing order. And he says that this was demonstrated by the imposition of wage slavery on the just emancipated people of Haiti. And James says, political treachery is not a monopoly of the white race. Political leadership is a matter of program, strategy, and tactics. And that's what's needed. So, all right, so that's the kind of my summary of the chapter. And let's see, I'm 21 minutes. And if I could just take like 5 more and talk about some reviews. So let's see. Left Voice wrote that, and I can paste these links for y'all. So there's a Left Voice piece, there's a Jacobin piece, which is garbage, and then there's an ISO piece, which was good. So I'll start with the Left Voice first piece. They say that Haider offers a perspective on the relationship between the universal and the particular. He points out that the only way to fight for a perspective of universal emancipation is to fight so that no particular group remains oppressed. Louverture gave Bonaparte in 1799. Oh, you know what? I basically read that quote, so never mind. So anyway, they focus on that too. So, and then I'm going to skip over to the ISO piece, which is from like, I don't know, a year or two before we dissolved. And it says to warn, just a couple of pull quotes, to warn against a one-dimensional conclusion that any sign of identity politics is automatic proof that a struggle is doomed to their neutralizing effect. Sorry, I didn't contextualize that too well. Basically, it's warning of like bending the stick too far and being too opposed to identity politics. Because there's that obviously very progressive seed, and that needs to be watered. So, and this is a comrade of Fanon, and she says in this ISO piece, she says a rich idea of solidarity emerges from the book, one that avoids reductionism, class reductionism, as well as crude universalism, refusing victimhood as well as selfishness. Haider calls this principle insurrectionary universalism, a term which I think pithily sums up the best of the socialist tradition's legacy on anti-racism. So that was good. And then just a couple of quick notes from Left Voice on the Jacobin review. Jacobin comes off with this real class reductionist economist argument about this, like a rejection of Haider's book, and is actually kind of, Left Voice says, is arguing for an opportunistic adaptation to the white working class and its prejudices. Such a position sees the self-organization of the specially oppressed as divisive and as an obstacle to achieving reforms. The Left Voice calls this tendency in Jacobin the anti-racism on the left. And so instead of an identity-based particularism that supposedly fragments the working class, Nashek, the Jacobin writer, proposes a class-based universalism and a strategy capable of amassing a force powerful enough to change society. This is that tired ass class reductionist Marxist argument. Leftwich says, actually, the struggle is not between universalism and particularism, but between two antagonistic universalisms. The first is a false universalism that claims that particular demands, like liberation from gender oppression, must be subordinated to a few economic measures. The other is a universalism that understands the profound links, both strategic and structural, between capitalist exploitation and racial oppression. So I like that, the good kind. Leftwich correctly calls out that class reductionism is tied to reformism. They say the fight against racism, imperialist oppression, or the oppression of women can be divisive. This is based on the purely electoral calculation. I don't think it's purely, but anyway, on the purely electoral calculation that dealing with the questions of racism or gender would prevent the reformist left from broadening its electoral base. And then this is where my mind always goes. And I'm glad that Leftwich takes them to task to wrap up. They say the culmination of this nationalist conception of the working class was manifested in the catastrophe of 1914, when the Second International voted in favor of war credits, abandoning the interests of the international working class to embrace the nationalism of the imperialist nations. The Third International, in contrast, was founded after the Russian Revolution with a call to struggle for workers' power, for the emancipation of women, and the self-determination of all oppressed peoples, including Black people in the United States.